Hi everyone, I'm here with Corinna Cohn. Corinna is a gender critical trans person who is currently the host of the Heterodox podcast together with Nina Paley. Heterodox invited me as a guest recently, thank you very much. And while we were chatting after the recording, I learned that I had left Corinna out of a footnote in my book where I tried to track the history of people starting to refer to themselves as gender critical. And I'm just popping up the article for anyone who might not have seen it. So it was this article, The Trans Women Who Say That Trans Women Aren't Women, by Michelle Goldberg in 2015. And Goldberg talked to 4 trans women who at the time were already apostate, so trans people that were critiquing and questioning the claim that trans women are women. And in this note in my book, I only mentioned 2 of them, sorry. So that was Miranda Yardley and Helen Highwater. And I left out Corinna and actually a 4th person, Aoife Hart. Okay, then my embarrassment, sort of scholarly embarrassment, soon translated into excitement because now I have a direct line to someone trans who was there in the days of the gender critical movement emerging. And that's several years before I would even kind of hear the words gender critical. Which for me probably wasn't until 2018 with the GRA consultation in the UK. So here the 2 of us are to talk about the earlier days of gender critical feminism and about being a gender critical trans person. So let's start. And I thought a maybe slightly silly place to start, but that could take us somewhere interesting, is are you cancelled? Or what was your first cancellation attempt and did it succeed?
That's interesting because I wouldn't say that I'm canceled per se. I would say that I have been exiled from the trans community, which is a little bit different from a cancellation. There was about 7 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, a technology that was developed called the Blockbot, which was for Twitter, an automated shared list of accounts that were, if your account was added onto the list, then you would automatically be blocked by the subscribers of the Blockbot.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the test case for their moderation team because they found themselves very conflicted as to whether or not they were going to put a trans person onto the block list because the original audience for the Blockbot was actually trans people.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to decide how much ideological purity they were going to enforce on the Blockbot. And they decided ultimately not only would they block me, but they would designate me as the worst of all threats.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay. Congratulations / sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. And how was that? How was that for you at the time? How upsetting did you find it? How did it have a big impact? Were you contributing a lot in that community?
It has 2 different impacts that are, I think, bad for everybody. The first is that, and this happens not because anybody's trans or anybody because believes in trans ideology. This can happen in any community, particularly even in the gender critical community. But when you deliberately block out voices that are trying to have discourse with you, not harass you or say mean and nasty things to you, but test your ideas and test them against their own ideas and try to understand different viewpoints. If you're deliberately blocking out that sort of exchange, it's bad for everybody because it puts you into an echo chamber and it deprives somebody else from understanding what your viewpoint is.
Yeah.
So it was bad for everybody for that reason, but it was also bad for everybody probably, but particularly them for another reason, which is that they gave me an additional challenge to try to overcome and communicate better.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas if they had just tolerated me and paid me a little bit of attention to the point where I was like, okay, fine, I got it off my chest, whatever, then I might have gotten bored or burned out and moved on and and occupied my time elsewhere.
Yeah.
But instead, I felt a challenge to invest and develop my views and try to learn to communicate them more clearly and more persuasively and more convincingly.
Mm-hmm.
So they set a hurdle in front of me and I learned to jump it.
Yeah. I think that's such a cool thing that for them and any political group to keep in mind, right? Sometimes that attempt to shut people up or cut them out, it doesn't create silence. It creates radicals maybe is the wrong word, right? But like very passionate people who will not be silenced. It doesn't always work, but sometimes that's the reaction, and those people can become very powerful and very effective. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, in one real sense, they made me who I am.
Yeah.
So thank you.
That's great. Thank you to my detractors. Okay, let's talk a bit about sort of 20. Well, I was thinking it was 2014, but then when I was looking this morning, I think it's like 2013 to 15, more accurately described. So I'll just say a tiny bit for anyone who's not sort of familiar. So there were sort of three things that I think were quite significant. One was in actually September 2013, so I thought it was 2014. The Reddit feminist community r/gender critical was created, and I've just got an archived version of the page up. It's now banned. And then in 2014, this article at Bitch Media was published, which has the title, "It's Time to End the Long History of Feminism Failing Transgender Women." And in that article, there's a sentence about the modern day feminists who continue to actively question the inclusion of trans people in women's spaces, and a description of those feminists as calling themselves either or radical feminists or gender critical feminists. And then in 2015, the Slate article that we've already mentioned that you were interviewed in. So I wanted to ask you, what do you remember about that time? Who were you talking to? How different was the discussion then around trans issues? How did you get connected with the other trans apostates? If you did, were you linked in with the radical feminists, or was that more like two separate communities sort of developing their critiques in parallel but not really in dialogue?
Well, I guess I should start with how I even got connected into this discourse in the first place.
Yeah.
Somewhere around the end of 2012, I had remembered that somebody had invited me to MishFest, which is the Michigan Women's Music Festival, which is a woman-only space. And I was just remembering the person who had invited me at one point, and I had remembered declining. At the time, I really wasn't into folk music, and it seemed like a very granola type of event, and I didn't think that I'd be very comfortable. And I kind of remember hearing that trans women were not very welcome there, so I was like, it doesn't seem like my sort of thing, so I declined. And I was curious about it at some point near, September or so of 2012. And I started researching it again, and I found that there was really a lot of animosity between trans women and radical feminists over the participation at the festival.
Yeah.
And at the time, so I would at the time describe myself as a trans woman. I don't tend to use that description anymore. But at the time I thought, well, there are so many commonalities in how women are marginalized and discriminated against, and how trans women are marginalized and discriminated against. And it seems like a real shame that there is animosity between these two groups, because even though we each have our distinct challenges, that we should nevertheless be able to put aside our animosities and figure out areas where we can build together. And I started writing blog posts on Tumblr under the name Anti-Orthodox. AUNTY, but sort of a pun. And trying to just think out loud about what some of the core conflicts were between these groups. And I publicized some of these writings on Twitter, where I also engaged in some discourse under the handle anti-orthodox. Mm-hmm. And what I came around to understand pretty quickly is that there really is, in the trans community, a lack of regard for women's boundaries. Mm-hmm. And whereas I thought, and I still think this, I think that when you have places like, let's say, gay and lesbian bars, or nightclubs, or parties, places, pride parties, any place where there's a lot of public interaction and there's not a need for a lot of privacy, that designating these spaces as being broadly inclusive mm-hmm. isn't a big deal. Mm-hmm. And that at the same time, that when women, particularly lesbians, want to set up spaces that are exclusively female, they ought to be able to do so without condemnation or anger. Yeah. It's the same sort of courtesy that people who are trans have asked for before, is having trans-only spaces. Mm-hmm. And it was surprising to me how little regard that some members of the trans community had for these boundaries that women wanted to put up. And I started noticing that and saying, hey, we should exercise this principle that we should extend to others the courtesies that we wish that others would respect as well. Yeah. And naturally, that argument was understood. Everybody said, actually, yeah, that does make a lot of sense. We should start being a lot more respectful. And everybody lived happily ever after. Actually, that's not what happened. No. It's more accurate to say that.
Can I just quickly, just to clarify before you move on, do you have a sense at the time of what the disregard for women wanting that was? Was it moralized, like it's wrong that they want it, so we shouldn't listen to them because they're morally in the bad? Or was it, what's your sense of why that was disregarded?
Well, it's this really astonishing entitlement that because the individuals making the claim that they are women, that they are therefore women in all respects, all regards, and therefore entitled to all of the rights and privileges and access to the same spaces as females.
Mm-hmm. So it's sort of a sense from the male side about what they're entitled to and what they're owed, than a sense that like women are doing something morally wrong or like, excluding or violating their human. Do you see what I'm asking? Like what?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you think it was more like, no, there's just a sort of sense that once you've declared yourself a woman, that's the end of the matter, and now you go where you want. And
yeah, I think one thing that seems to be changing a bit, maybe gradually or subtly over the last 10 years, is that I think 10 years ago, the claim would have been more like, I have transitioned.
I see.
I have taken hormones, I've changed my name, I've changed my appearance. I've taken substantial material steps towards trying to convert from masculinity to femininity or to become a female. And because I have taken these actions, because I am doing these things, because I'm following the program, therefore I'm entitled to these benefits now.
Got it. Yeah.
But I think 10 years ago that would have been typical. Today, that your formulation of I've made the claim that I'm female, now I'm entitled, I think is a lot more accurate to the 2020 plus post 2020 world that we're in.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. No, that makes sense. You were on a thread and I derailed you. Do you remember where you were going?
It was only to say that while I was trying to find some sort of middle ground and to try to persuade my brethren to occupy it.
Yeah.
That I was rejected in my attempts to appeal to my own community.
Got it. I see. And then is that what creates a link between you and some of the feminists? Like you're sort of cast out of one group, but you then have common political cause with another, or were you sort of then also not accepted over here and then just trying to like make this argument politically by yourself? Like what happens then?
There is a feminist who's still active on Twitter who goes by the name Feminist Roar.
Yep.
I don't know if you know her.
Yep.
But at one point, she and I had a really nice discussion, and this goes back to what I was saying before, that if you don't engage other people who have different ideas, then you're never going to learn anything.
Yeah.
She challenged me to explain what I meant when I claimed that, trying to remember the exact formulation. I claimed that saying that it was impossible to change sex was bioessentialist.
Yeah.
And she invited me to explain what I meant by that. And as I was working through my explanation, I realized that I was actually wrong.
Yeah.
that what's actually essentialist is to say that there's some such thing as an essential feminine essence, or an essential masculine essence, and that's the thing that determines your sex. And I was like, wow, that actually doesn't make any sense at all. I have to rethink some things here.
And did you do that? Did you sort of perform that publicly, or did you sort of freak out while you were trying to write the thread and then sort of go away and regroup a bit?
I went to regroup, but I had to admit to her,
yeah,
I understand how you mean this now, and I understand that I had I was thinking about it wrong.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's so.
And
God, imagine what Twitter would be like if you could have those kinds of conversations and people would admit where they got stumped and needed to think a bit more.
I unfortunately continue to have this naive belief that other people should be able to easily have that type of epiphany. And that's what it is. It's an epiphany. So it's not like you can put a quarter into the machine and get a little epiphany out of it. The epiphany hits you when the right confluence of wisdom and phrasing and like maturity occur.
Yeah.
All of those elements have to be present. But I really wish that, and I hope that as I communicate things, and as I become a better communicator, that I may be able to grease the path for other people so that they can get to similar realizations with less emotional trauma.
Yeah.
Could get there a little bit faster, a little bit easier.
Yeah, and I think no one's gonna, I mean, this is just such a tired thing to say, but no one's gonna get there being attacked, right? Like that's the sort of thing that makes people dig in and run away. So this dominant behavior on Twitter of just being just such an asshole, like, and so uncharitable, that's never going to get those moments. But those moments are what you're actually wanting, at least in some cases. So yeah, the style of it really has to change.
My side, whatever we would call it, has a lot of execution errors, in my opinion. That they work to create enemies when they could be making. You're not necessarily making friends, but what you're trying to do is produce uncertainties in the people whose viewpoints are very fixed.
Yeah.
But when you turn those people into enemies, you're not producing uncertainty, you're producing defensive-ness, which makes them double down on what they believe is certain.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. Okay. I'm wondering if there's a tiny bit of that I'm not sure if we quite covered, which is there so you've got people like Feminist Raw, and there's obviously this sort of like rad fem discourse. Is it that there's like a teaming up of people like yourself, and now there's a sort of movement that includes like rad femmes and trans apostates and I don't know who else, the fence, or is it like, no, there's still too much tension for that to be a common cause? So really these things are kind of largely proceeding independently. I mean, I know even to
Yeah.
this day there's a kind of tension, right, where like Women's Place UK would platform a transsexual person, and then some of the feminists would be really angry that this should be women only. So I'm sort of wondering, has it always just been that sort of tension, or was it kind of healthier? Was it, yeah, have things changed, or has
Yes.
it, yeah.
Early on, there were hardly any transsexuals in this part of the discourse.
Yeah.
And so there wasn't any teaming up. For the most part, it was me and a couple of other individuals, mostly American,
Yeah.
who were writing on Tumblr or on Twitter and just trying to, you try to come at this from a lot of angles. We have become better at communicating around these types of topics, but when you're first trying to figure out the right angle of approach, there's all sorts of small essays that you write in blogs to say, well, let's think about it from this way. Let's think about it from this way.
Mm-hmm.
And there were just a couple of trans people doing that. And then there was I'm not going to get everybody's names. Elizabeth Hungerford wrote some essays, who I'm sure you know about.
Yeah.
I'm having trouble having a good name recall right now, but there are a few women who are writing about these issues, and I would say that there's maybe a belief of some of these feminist writers that trans women are not evil, like it's more of a morally neutral viewpoint,
Yeah.
and that as long as people are treating each other respectfully, that there can be some coexistence, right? So that was sort of the attitude.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
There are feminists who believe that there is no such thing as being able to go along and get along with transsexuals. And I understand some of the reasons for that, particularly considering how some of my brethren behave.
Yeah.
But at that time, there was more of this idea of how do we accommodate everybody in a way that's peaceful.
Yeah. It's yeah, I guess it's just a very interesting tension there, right? Because you can understand on the one hand, part of the principle of the thing is like women only space and the right to set boundaries and have them respected. So of course it's comprehensible why there would be a hard line on it. But on the other hand, in terms of making political traction on your views, the people who it costs the most and benefits the least are the most credible spokespeople. And so there's something like nuts about not accepting the kind of camaraderie and help of the gender critical trans person. And I'm sure that's part of the reasoning that a Women's Place has in mind. Like when the public sees, like, yeah, one of the UK gender critical transsexuals speaking out, it's like, it's not in their interest to say, I shouldn't be allowed in women only spaces. So yeah, I think that's just it's probably an unresolvable tension, but it's like pragmatically, it's a good idea to team up, and then somehow in principle, given what is actually at stake, you can see how it's a sort of bad idea. So,
well, but here's a different side to it. In the 10 years that I've been communicating on these issues, there have been a small number of trans women, including one of the ones that was mentioned in that article, who have just flipped out and gone crazy.
Oh, okay.
and it's more than one. I can think of 3 or 4 who have presented themselves as being gender critical,
Yeah.
have received a lot of positive attention and admiring comments from women who are so grateful to have a trans ally for feminist women,
Yeah.
and then something breaks down. There's always going to be women who feminist women or gender critical women. No matter what I do, they're always going to hate me.
Yeah.
Small number, but they're always going to hate me.
Yeah.
And they tend to make hateful comments towards me. They made hateful comments towards these ones who ended up flipping out.
Yeah.
And it's because ultimately they felt very damaged and bruised by the criticism.
Yeah.
And they're like, I'm trying.
Yeah.
And if this is the way that you're going to treat me, well then fuck you. And they'll flip the table over.
Yeah. Which makes
I don't
sense.
think that,
I mean, it makes sense, right? That someone would be driven to that point by negative treatment. That's perfectly understandable, right?
It's understandable, but I have to question how sincere somebody is about their motives.
Yeah.
If some criticism is going to cause them to flip their views 180 degrees. I mean, it's one thing to get burned out and close your accounts and say, fine, do it on your own.
Yeah.
Good luck. It's another thing to just completely go around and adopt the misogynist viewpoint.
What you're saying. Sorry, I thought flipped out means like had a mental breakdown and freaked out at everyone and quit the movement in a huff, rather than like became a trans activist.
No, I can think of a couple that have really become
switched sides.
Strange individuals.
I see. Okay, no, that I can see that. I guess I was just thinking, I can imagine, like, it's already horrible, I think, for any of us who are gender critical. Like, it's a really insulting and unpleasant movement, and maybe that's what every political movement is like. I haven't been in other ones. I don't know if the climate Extinction Rebellion are just going around really being mean to each other all the time. Like, maybe, but it's unpleasant for the most comfortable of us, which I think I'm probably one of them. Then it's going to be awful, I'm sure, for a transsexual person.
Yeah.
Then hearing all these, like constant characterization of everyone as a fetishist, and like, you know, that's I can see how that would be really hard to take, and it would make you freak out if not. But point taken, not flip sides politically. That's something else.
Yeah, you need to have some thick skin.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go on to TERF as a slur. So if I understand correctly, and did I prepare that? Yes, I did prepare this as well. So you used to run a Tumblr site called TERF as a slur, archiving Tumblr posts that were speaking about TERFs in abusive or offensive ways. And I think the last posts I could find there were from August 2014. And so I'm supposing that the site that probably some of us are more familiar with, which is this one, terfasaslur.com, must have kind of started around the time that you were stopping. And that site focused on posting screenshots from Twitter. So maybe that was the Tumblr Twitter changeover time. So can you tell me about why you started that Tumblr site and what the reaction to it was like, how much uptake you got, stuff like that?
Sure. I don't know if you've done some research into the origins of the term TERF.
But I only know about the person who was allegedly radical feminist herself, who claimed to have come up with it. Yeah, Viv someone.
Right.
Is it right?
But she didn't popularize it.
Right.
There were trans activists who popularized it, and the individual who's probably most responsible for popularizing the term is an editor of the trans advocate blog named Kristen Williams.
Okay.
Who purchased the domain name called The TERFs from another trans identified person who was one of the ones who flipped out and got angry.
Mm-hmm.
So at the time, this was not a very common term,
Mm-hmm.
and those two individuals did quite a lot in order to popularize it. So for quite some time, if you were to Google the term TERF, the top page full of hits would have been links to Kristen Williams' blog explaining what trans exclusionary radical feminists were.
Okay.
And in fact, I'd say for the first couple of years that the term TERF was being used, it was just as often expanded to mean trans exterminatory radical feminist.
Oh wow. Okay, I've seen
So-
that
so-
occasionally on Twitter, but I've never seen it like used as a serious thing that it's supposed to mean.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's stabilized.
Okay.
It's stabilized. So it was apparent to me that in any grammatical setting where the term TERF was being used, that you could replace it with bitch,
Yep,
or some other language, and that no context would change.
yeah,
The sentence would mean the same thing. And I did a little bit of research on my own into what slurs were.
Yep.
And I found enough material that describes what a slur is that it was just evident that this was something that very much along the lines of feminazi.
Yep.
So, something along those lines. So I started responding to examples on Twitter of people using the word TERF, and I would just like snapshot it or quote it and use the hashtag TERF is a slur.
yep,
And I thought that if I could accumulate enough examples of people using TERF in that context, that I wouldn't have to even make an argument about why TERF is a slur, that there would be a sufficient body of evidence that
Yeah.
it would speak for itself that it's a slur.
Yeah.
So if you go back and you look at the TERF is a slur Tumblr, so often what you see is me just quoting somebody and saying, here's how, like it's just so straightforward. Here's how TERF is being used as a slur in this example. TERF is a slur.
I was just
And,
trying to show that, but it just told me I need to be signed into Tumblr, so that was unhelpful.
Yeah. At one point, there's an trans activist who's still quite influential today called Zinnia Jones.
Mm-hmm.
And Zinnia Jones got very reactive about this assertion that TERF is a slur and just made this big long post that all it was repeating the phrase TERF, 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 TERF. And I thought, well, thank you for the example.
Oh,
Somewhere around the end of 2014, one of the trans activists who I'd previously mentioned here, not Kristen Williams, I haven't named this person, became fixated on a radical feminist and was threatening her and threatening her children. And I interjected and I said something. I reprimanded this person, and I probably piled on a little bit as well because I was angry about the threats. And he became extremely angry and started threatening me. He worked in computer security, and so had some connections to resources that could potentially be harmful to me. And so I discontinued operating the TERF is a slur Tumblr because of that reason.
Yeah.
I got scared.
Yeah, okay. It's so interesting that I was just thinking my experience like around 2018, I observed the same thing you observed. I didn't know about any of these archives yet at the time, I think. And my very first dipping my toe in to being gender critical was on Facebook, sharing an article that had just argued, hey, maybe if you disagree with someone, don't call them names. And that is like ad hominem. That's like a fallacy everyone learns from first year philosophy onwards. So in my philosophical networks on Facebook, that shouldn't even have to be said, and it certainly shouldn't be controversial. And I got a horrible, swift reaction, of course, from the like trans activist philosophers. And then I think at some point after that kind of asserted, no, TERF is a slur. And I had all these like, oh, I'm a philosopher of language and I can tell you for sure, having studied slurs, that TERF is not, mansplaining, like crazy. And then I was so like what you described earlier about like when people are assholes and you dig in. I went and read the entire slurs literature to try to see whether there would be a single account of slurs on which TERF would not come out as one, and I couldn't find a single one. It's just like
that's right, because TERF is a slur.
Yeah, but I was like, these guys, who do they think they are that they can show up, claim their expertise, and tell me something that's an outright lie?
Yeah.
And then I'm not going to look at the literature. Like, what the fuck?
So I don't believe that their position can be defended, but I think that we can pretend for a second, or at least mention what the main argument is, or is against the idea that TERF is a slur. And that the idea is, I think it has two components. The first is that radical feminist is not a slur, and that trans exclusionary is merely descriptive.
Yeah.
So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is that TERF is language that an oppressed minority is using or developing in order to name their oppressor.
Yeah.
And because of the power dynamics, it cannot be considered a slur because it's the direction of offense is going towards the more powerful party.
Yeah.
And both of those things are sort of bullshit.
Yeah. Another one I encountered was that you can only use a slur against an unchosen or highly involuntarist attribute. So something like race or sex, and maybe religion if you're like indoctrinated since birth. But it's not a slur to call someone an incel or a conservative or whatever, because that's a chosen politics or morality. So I often came up against that objection, like, no, TERF, you've chosen to be a rad femme, and that's up to you, but now you're going to have to cop it when we say you're a piece of shit. Which is also interesting and worth discussing. But I think, like you say, once you kind of just show all the ways in which it's used and what it's used alongside and what it's doing, it's hard to deny that it's being used in this kind of super abusive way. Okay, let's move on because I'm conscious we are going to run out of time. And I was going to try to aim for an hour. Are you needing to be somewhere? Or is it okay if we run a little over? Otherwise, I might just make some choices about.
We can run a little over.
Okay, cool. So let's go to GenSpect. So I'll pop that up as well, and I'll put the link in the video. So you had this great conversation last year, I think it was, with GenSpect. And one of the things you said in the, what do we call that, an interview or in the event, during the event, you talked about being a young same-sex attracted person and being led to a trans identification rather than a gay identification. And I know that some of the gender critical people say, in particular in relation to the discourse around conversion therapy and trans people, that we've kind of got things the wrong way around. So there's this political shift to like protect trans people from change or suppression practices, but actually they say, or maybe I would say, affirming, like having an affirmation only approach to gender identity is a form of conversion of sexual orientation, or at least sexual orientation identity, given the complexities there. So I wondered what you thought about that claim.
regarding the claim of conversion therapy
Yeah, like
as it pertains to...
Yeah, do you agree with that criticism that it's like, no, it's not that we need to protect both trans and gay people from conversion, it's that we need to be careful not to affirm gay kids into transness. I guess that would be the thought.
This is complicated. I think for both sexes, for different reasons, that you cannot make a blanket statement that somebody who is seeking to change their gender identity or who are making claims that they have a gender identity that's incongruous with their sex.
Yeah.
I don't think that you can make a blanket statement that it is same-sex attraction that motivates all of these kids. And even for the ones who it does motivate, I think that there still may be extenuating circumstances around that child's environment or the way that they've been treated growing up that may complicate that. So on one hand, I do believe that there are a large number of same-sex attracted boys and girls who are being led down the path of transition.
Yeah.
But I believe that there are also considerable numbers of heterosexual or opposite sex attracted young people who are likewise being encouraged to transition.
Yeah.
And one group that really stands out to me are the young women who identify as gay boys. They're definitely attracted to males.
Yeah.
It's not ambiguous, but there's something that has happened in the way that they're processing their attraction, that they think that they have to masculinize in order to be proper partners for their sexual targets.
Yeah. So is what you're saying, if the if the gender critical focus is only narrowly on kind of wrongly affirming or transitioning gay kids, they're missing out on this much broader cohort of people who also maybe are not in fact trans and shouldn't just be kind of carelessly affirmed. So the narrative needs to be wider about the affirmation only approach, not just kind of... Yeah, good. That's really helpful. Okay. Let's talk about pronouns. So Nina, your co-host on Heretic's, uses male pronouns for you, and she and I, as you probably saw, had a bit of a Twitter thread about it where I asked about it. And she claimed that you are not interested in policing anyone else's language. And I just thought it's super interesting to me to talk about that a little bit more, because my policy has been preferred pronouns for friends and just preferred pronouns for misogynists, which is like a really bizarre ad hoc policy. And my workplace mandates them, so I have to sort of use them for colleagues and students, for example. So I'm in this kind of weird patchwork position. So I mean, one thing I did want to ask is, like, do you find it hurtful to hear male pronouns, or was there a point at which you did and then you kind of...
I used to. Yeah,
so can we talk a bit about that? And then also, A, your experience, but B, do you think the way that this discussion is going is going to be that it's just going to... trans people are just going to have to get used to or comfortable with being misgendered by at least some people some of the time, given the sort of feminist case for sex-based pronouns? So start with you and then...
Yeah, I think for any trans woman who wants to be able to get along successfully and peacefully in society, that he will have to get used to being misgendered.
Yeah. Okay.
So before I met Nina, and this was earlier in the time that I was engaging in some of this discourse, there were radical feminists who said, I will only use sex-based pronouns.
Yeah.
It's not because I am trying to hurt somebody, but this is important, at least for the reason that the way that you name things affects the way that you think about things. And I'm not going to think about male people as being women, so I'm going to use sex-based pronouns.
Yeah.
And I thought, actually, that's a political mentality or an ideology. That's a political position.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to disrespect somebody's political position when it's not meant to be personal.
Yeah.
I respect I respect people's politics that I disagree with. I believe that we have I know there's a good phrase to describe this, but respecting other people's right to think as they wish to, right?
Yeah.
What sort of person would I be if I demanded that they adhere to my belief system or adhere to my values? I think that would make me a bigot and potentially also an authoritarian, depending on if I had an enforcement mechanism.
Yeah.
And I don't want that. So that was an abstract thing that I believed in up until the point that I met Nina, who is somebody who's in my life who actually applies that philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
So she calls me he and him, and I am fine with that.
Okay.
The idea that I have is that people choose their own words.
Yeah.
And that it's more important for me that people be the masters of their own language than to buckle and allow themselves to be coerced into using other people's language. That is a really dangerous road to go down when you cede your own freedom of speech. There are times that you're polite because that just greases the social wheels. But if it's compelled and it has nothing to do with your choice of being polite, then actually you're losing something. And not only are you losing something, you're giving up something. Mm-hmm. It might seem small, but you've already accepted that you are coercible. I don't want to coerce anybody. I don't care if somebody calls me she and her, or there's a shop that I go into where they call me they for some reason. I didn't ask for it, but she just decided to call me they. Yeah. And whatever.
Yeah. There's a move in
I would like to make a.
Oh no,
sorry?
Go ahead, please.
I wanted to make a note about non-binary pronouns, though.
Yeah, go for it.
So I will not use non-binary pronouns for anybody. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is this. Somebody who claims to be non-binary is somebody who is claiming that they are not male or female. Mm-hmm. And I do not, what they're saying when they say I'm not male or I'm not female, what they're saying is that I feel alienated or segregated from my sex. I do not feel like I am part of my sex. I want you to call me they because I am alienated from my sex. I do not want to participate or enable somebody's self-exile from their own sex categories. I don't think it's healthy for somebody to feel like they're not part of the sex category that they're born particularly, but to say that they're completely outside of it, I'm not going to be a party in enabling that.
Okay, interesting. I've noticed some of the non-binary philosophers lately making some sort of complex claim where it's not that they deny their sex, but they deny that they are male or female. So they seem to have do you know what I mean? You can sort of add enough gender into the previously sex terms that you get to say you're not those things because those things have this social meaning. Oh, but we're not sex denialists. Of course I don't deny that I have a reproductive system set up to do X. And I was just trying to process that as you were talking. It's not, I think they would say you're not necessarily participating in their alienation from their sex because they don't deny their sex. They just deny that the words male or female describe them because they're closer to being gender terms than sex terms. And I think that would be the move. But then, of course, they have a little sneaky card up their sleeve because there's no sex terms. So suddenly you're hamstrung in what you're able to say or describe. And they never really address that. So
what clever people.
Yeah, it's an infuriating game, or yeah, whatever it is. Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay. Sorry. I need to think about some of that. So I think maybe this could be the last question.
What do you call me?
She. Because we have a face-to-face interaction. I like you. And I do use preferred pronouns for my friends. I can see all the things you're saying. I think they're interesting and they make sense. And they're how I feel when I'm told to call Rachel McKinnon she. Like, fuck no. So I have that tension where I understand how some feminists feel, and I hate the university having the policy that compels me against my politics to use these pronouns on campus. If I got a misogynist colleague, right, and then I have to call him she, I would feel so constrained. So I totally get all those arguments for not doing it or not having to do it. But at the same time, yeah, I think we very often in interpersonal cases are careful with each other's pains and traumas, right? Like your friend just had a miscarriage, so you don't talk about babies around her for a while or whatever. And so there's something where like knowing that someone feels really on edge about it or vulnerable about it or whatever, you would just go out of your way to be careful. And it's clear that you've sort of like gotten yourself to this very enlightened place where that's not hurting you anymore. But I suppose if it still is really hurting a lot of trans people, then there's this that goes on one side of the scale, right? We wouldn't normally just like, my politics trumps your pain. So it's, yeah, I don't quite know how to come down on all of that.
Do you mind if I get myself into some real trouble here? It's not fun. It's not fun to not. Do you know the term mansplaining?
Yep.
That's when a man explains something to a woman, particularly if it's something that is presumably the woman has some expertise in, and the man is providing what may potentially be that's what I'm doing now is obviously you know what mansplaining is.
Yeah. No, it was a great demonstration.
Yeah. Thank you. You know, it's a practical demonstration. Yeah. I think that there are some women who are primed to take offense.
Yeah.
Whenever a man explains anything to them, when after all, anytime that there are two individuals who are trying to communicate with each other and are trying to locate each other in that same understanding, yeah, that there is always an opportunity for one of them to explain something to the other that they might already know, and that this is just the process of like locking up and like forming a common understanding. Do we understand things the same way? And that some women are primed to take offense to that and just label it as mansplaining. Mm-hmm. And that priming to be offended, I think, is exactly analogous to people who are trans being primed to take offense. That if somebody recognizes them as their biological sex and uses a pronoun that matches that.
Yeah. Okay.
So good. So maybe I'm a jerk face, but I have a lot less consideration for somebody's primed or learned sense of taking offense at something which is probably not meant to be offensive at all.
Yeah. No,
so I'm less sensitive.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair rejoinder, and it's certainly one that I've thought about with regard to the sort of like new trans cohort. Like, if you're just doing gender fuck or whatever, There's no sense in
Mhm.
which it's like personally extremely painful to you to be referred to as the sex you obviously are. That's ridiculous. But I think I do sort of
Yes,
have this reserved sense of like, no, there are some people for whom this has been a really long-term thing, and they really do think they pass, and so it's like horrible to them to be kind of told they don't in an abrupt way. And you read the testimonies of the person that just then goes and cries in the car for an hour. Didn't you say that actually in an article that I was reading yesterday? That
I
early,
did.
yes, exactly. So it's like
I
that is
did.
pain. That's pain, right? And we shouldn't just
Yeah,
cause that recklessly. Um, but I don't know how that translates
right.
into a general policy about pronouns, because of course you can't know, or maybe you can know. Like the rainbow hair probably isn't serious, but maybe the sort of older person is. I don't know, but yeah. Sorry, I just used an example that then I remembered it was you, so that was funny.
That was me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was before I stumbled on this pathway of towards gender criticism, but that was probably a necessary step along the way of um, I was sort of at the bottom of or at the top of my depression curve, right? Like it's never going to get better. I have to realize somehow this is how I am and this is how people see me, and I'm sure that given that that's a thing that I remember so keenly, I think that for sure that has to be one of those events that made me think that there's got to be a different way of processing my feelings,
Yeah.
a different model that should work.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. This will be the last question, because I don't want to keep you too long. And I'm gonna try and just I tried to write this out and then it was just stupid and long and rambling. So I'm just gonna try to ask it concisely and see what happens. Um, this a kind of moral question I've been trying to like grapple with is, and it sort of came up earlier, I think, when you talked about the sense that some transsexuals in particular would have that they've made the transition, they've paid the price, or they've taken on the costs,
Mhm.
right? So I was thinking, um, like older transsexuals have some sort of legitimate expectation for the long term shape or plan of their lives, that if they made this decision then and kind of paid the costs of it, physical pain, money, whatever, then they kind of have secured this status and they can kind of live with that status in the long term. Okay, so then my kind of moral question was like, something like, isn't it quite shit what's happening with the current politics around this, and especially the sort of new cohort of trans who have all these other motivations and maybe have not taken on any costs, that it might end up leading to like a real shutting down of access to, yeah, that way of life or that social treatment or that legal status or anything else? Isn't it a particular injustice against those specific people who kind of had the reasonable long-term view that if I take on these costs, I will get to kind of live this life? Does that make sense as a question?
Makes perfect
Okay,
sense.
great.
I speak about something in I put it in terms of the former social contract.
Mm-hmm.
There was a social contract. Women did not get to go to the polls and vote on this contract or sign on to the contract, but this is how it used to be. It used to be that, and this was almost exclusively men who were transitioning to live as women,
Yeah.
that if you were going to transition, you needed to pass. You needed to change your appearance. You needed to learn how to dress. You needed to learn how to speak differently. You needed to do all sorts of, you needed to change your body. You needed to have a sex change. There are all sorts of things that were necessary to pass. And I know I get roasted from time to time. Well, you don't pass. All right, fine. But the old contract was you had to work at it. You had to try.
Yeah.
And you did. And to the extent that somebody noticed what your birth sex was, that was on you.
Yeah.
And to the extent that you didn't get your documentation fixed, that was on you. to the extent that you didn't have whatever surgeries that were needed in order to produce the appearance that you were the opposite sex, that was on you.
Mhm.
And if you got misgendered, that was on you. That's the old social contract. That's dead.
Yeah.
It's dead, it's gone. And there's the term for people who do not disclose that they have a past of being the opposite sex or the sex that they are. The word that we would use for that was stealth.
Mhm.
There are people who transitioned and were stealth and are going to remain stealth as long as they possibly can. Their documentation got updated at a time when there was a process to do that. There are some people who are going to live the rest of their lives and die stealth.
Yeah.
For most of us, we are worldwide in a period of change right now,
Yeah.
where there's a war between the radical trans ideology, which the ultimate goal of that is self-ID,
Yeah.
which has already been instituted in a number of Western countries. I think that all of those are going to roll back. I think it's inevitable that all of those roll back.
Mm-hmm.
I believe what is likely to happen is that there will be more regulated spaces, sex-based spaces. For people like me, it probably won't be a big deal. For people who are transitioning more recently, it will probably be a lot harder. Jails it used to be under the old contract because of all the things that I just said. If you had sex reassignment surgery and you looked like a woman and you committed a crime, you would be housed with women.
Yeah.
And the other women might not even know.
Right.
And it would be something that would be quiet.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't want any of the women to find out because you would be shunned and attacked.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be masculine looking men with penises in those spaces. It would have been people who were feminine. That's gone. If I ever go to jail, which I won't, I'm a good person, I promise. If I do, it'll be to a men's prison.
And is the thing that you think changed that you say the social contract, that social contract is dead, that's because of the new ideology and how much it's been pushing for? Yeah.
It's not just because the new ideology, but it is because the new ideology demanded a reaction. And as I tell people, the world does not need transsexuals.
Mm-hmm.
The world does not need people like me in it. It does need people like you in it. It needs women in it. But it doesn't need people like me in it. And if you're going to play chicken and say, I'm going to get my rights or I'm going to lose all my rights, I'm going to get all of your rights or I'm going to lose all my rights. That's what the radical trans activists proposition is. They don't say it like that, because all that they say is, I'm going to get all your rights. But the backlash that they're inviting is, well, you're going to lose all your rights. And I am aware that this is what the dynamic is. I believe that it is almost certain that the outcome will be that there will be a reactionary backlash that will strictly regulate sex-based spaces and privileges and rights, and that the trans people are going to get caught in the backlash. I believe that. I get criticized by my brethren for saying this because they think that I am trying to make it happen.
Yeah.
I am not. I am warning them that this is happening, but they want to kill the messenger.
Yeah. No,
I'm sorry. That's actually just a warning.
I was thinking that while you were saying it, that it's like exactly the bit someone's going to clip and be like, trans extermination, right? Like the world doesn't need us. Yeah, it's so interesting because I don't know, I can't remember exactly where it was, but Andrea Dworkin had this worry about women becoming obsolete, and if I remember correctly, it was in relation to. Now I can't remember if it was in relation to bio wombs or transsexuals, but I can sort of, like if your focus, if your central concept of what women are for is kind of more to do with like reproduction and perpetuating the species, then I can see the justification for the line, like the world doesn't need transsexuals. But if your central concept is like sexual subordination, beautiful things to be fucked, the stuff we were talking about in the Heterodox episode, then I think some feminists have this anxiety they're going to replace us, right? So, and Joanna Russ's sci-fi novel actually has this world in it where a misogynistic world has replaced women with effeminate men. And so it's like interesting that there's anxieties coming from both the trans and the women about which one becomes not needed anymore. Yeah, I just think that's super interesting. I mean, your prediction, your warning is probably currently more like empirically well grounded, but it's just interesting that there's both anxieties, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I can't see a world where most men would be satisfied with somebody like me.
Yeah, maybe I guess in the
I can cook.
In the novel, it was because women had become full separatists, so they didn't have a choice. So maybe that's why it's far-fetched. Anyway, thank you so much for your time. This has been super interesting, and I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Cheers.